What's up, everyone? We've talked a lot about what Next.js is and when you should use it. Now, it's time to get started with a Next.js project. It only takes a few minutes to get started with a Next.js project. Before we begin, though, you'll want to make sure your machine has Node.js 18.18 or later already installed on it. If you don't, follow the link in the description of this video to get that installed. Other than that, not much is required except a Mac OS, Windows, or Linux machine. Chances are, if you're watching this video, you've already met this requirement. The quickest and easiest way to get started with Next.js is to use the terminal command npx create next app at latest, which will install the latest version of Next.js for you. You'll be prompted to name your project and make a few other selections before installation begins. So at first, this is asking me if it can install the following package, which is create next app at 15.3.2. I will type in yes. And now I will get these prompts where I can type in the name of my project, which I can just do next example. I would like to use TypeScript. I don't want to use ESLint. I don't want to use Tailwind. I would like a source directory. I will use the app router. I don't want TurboPack, and I can just use the default import alias here. And now this will install for me. I can now open my IDE and open a new project, which I will go to my desktop and then my folder for next example. And I can open this and trust the project. And now I see that I have a README and I'm able to access my next example here. So I can run npm dev in my terminal, and opening my local host, I'm able to see the default Next.js template. You also can install Next.js manually. You may need to do this if you already have an existing project that you want to install Next.js into. Typically, you'll always take the easy route to install Next.js, which was this first option here. If you end up having to manually install Next.js, you'll know why. So first, we'll just delete our public, our source, our nextconfig, anything related to our Next.js project here. So that's everything. So I'll delete that and our next and node modules just so we have an empty directory here. So the first thing we need to do is add a package.json file. And so with this added, we can add our scripts before installing anything. So we'll add the script dev to start, which will be next dev, and this starts the development server for us. Then we'll have build, which will be next build, which builds the application for production. Now you can run this during development to see how your build behaves in the build phase. The next one is start, which will be next start, which starts the production server. You can run this in development again to test how your project works in production without deploying it. And then finally we have lint, which will be nextlint, and this script runs ESLint. Now with all of these set up, we can install our dependencies. So we'll do that by running npm add next at latest, react latest, and react dom latest. Now that these are installed, I see a warning here where we need to run npm approve builds to finish installing Sharp here. And there's only one package to build. We can select Sharp and press enter and select yes. And now we can see that our package.json file looks correct. After configuring your package.json, you're able to create your main directory. As we've talked about, Next.js uses file system routing, so your file structure determines how your routes work. These routes are stored in an app directory. That means you'll need to create a new app directory. Inside this directory, let's create a new file called layout.tsx. We'll cover what this file does in more detail in a later video, but know for now that this is the root layout file that wraps all of your content stored in the app directory. You cannot skip the creation of this file. It's required and needs to contain both the HTML and body tags. It also needs to be called root layout, since this is the root layout of your entire project. Let's create one together now. So all we need to do is export default function root layout, which takes the children prop, and the children prop has the type React node. Now we get a warning that React needs to be imported. So we'll import React from React, and then we need to return first our HTML, And then we can pass in a body, which will have the children prop attached to it. And now we need to add the language attribute to the HTML tag, which we'll just set to English. Rest assured that if you forget to create this layout.tsx file, one will be created for you when you start your development server. We can then get our home page rendered by creating a page.tsx file. Again, we'll cover this in more detail in a video to come, but you must name this file page.tsx. If you're not using TypeScript, you can use page.jsx as well. And if you don't name it this, it will not be recognized by the router. Your homepage will be at the same level as your layout.tsx file, and it does not need to be named page, but we will export a default function called page, and then return an h1 that says homepage. Now we can run pnpm dev and refresh our page, and we can see that homepage shows up as an h1. Now, one thing you may notice as you run pnpm dev for the first time, the first thing is if you're using TypeScript, we detected TypeScript in your project and created a tsconfig.json file for you. We'll go over that file here in just a few moments. If you plan on adding a separate directory for your configuration files or a headless CMS like Payload CMS, you can place your app folder in a source directory. So we'll create a new directory called src or source at the root level of my project and drag my app into that source directory. So now in the source directory, I could add a new directory called components and store all of my components in there. As your project grows, doing this can help things be more clean. It's also recommended that you create a public folder as well. This is where you can store your assets like images, fonts, and more. The files inside the public folder can be referenced from the base URL, which in most cases will just be a /. To show you what I mean, I'll first create a new directory called public, and I'm going to paste one of my headshots in this project. So now we can see NLV headshot cropped, medium, JPEG. Now in my page.tsx, I can import image from next image. Now instead of passing in this h1 of homepage, I can use the image component, which takes a source, an alt, and will also pass in a height and width. So for the source, I know it to be NLV headshot cropped medium dot JPEG. And for our alt, we're going to use NLV codes headshot. Now, as you remember, Next.js does require an alt for accessibility purposes, but if the image is decorative, you can pass in an empty string. And now width and height can also be used. I happen to know the width and height of my image, and some CMSs and other tools like Payload CMS can define this for you programmatically, but I happen to know the dimensions right here. And now if I refresh, we see that my face shows up here instead of homepage. You may notice that I'm using TypeScript files. This isn't required, but it's my preferred way of using Next.js. Once you do add a TypeScript file and run pnpm dev, the necessary dependencies are added to your project automatically. This includes a tsconfig.json file that I mentioned earlier, and will have the recommended config options configured for you automatically. If you use VS Code, you can enable a TypeScript plugin by opening your command palette, searching for TypeScript, and selecting your TypeScript version, which you can just use the workspace version. TypeScript comes bundled with JetBrains web dev products, so there is no configuration needed there. Next.js automatically installs ESLint when you install Next.js into your project. I walked through how to add this script manually in the manual installation instructions earlier on in this video. You can configure your linter by running the command pnpm lint, which will prompt you to select strict, base, or cancel. Strict is, obviously, the stricter of the two options. This will apply a stricter rule set around core web vitals along with the base ESLint config. This is recommended if you're setting up ESLint for the first time. Base simply installs the base ESLint config. It's less strict and does not include the core web vitals rule set. Selecting either strict or base will install ESLint and ESLint config next as dependencies, and a new file .eslintrc.json will be created in the root of your project. This file will include the configuration that you selected. You can run p&pm lint every time you want it to catch errors. Once this is set up, it will run automatically during the build phase. Errors in this phase will cause the build to fail, but warnings won't. You'll simply see those logged as you build. If you choose the cancel option, this skips the configuration altogether. The last thing you may want to set up in your Next.js project is absolute imports and module path aliases. This allows you to shorten your imports, which improves readability as your project grows. You can adjust these settings in your tsconfig.json file. You'll first want to set a base URL configuration in the compiler options option. So you have your compiler options here, which includes all of the basic recommended options for your TypeScript config. We can add our base URL at the top of our file here, and we will set it to source. You can then add paths that point to specific paths you'd like to configure. For example, we will set up our paths for @components and then the wildcard for our components/wildcard directory. So we created a components directory already in our source folder. In that directory, we're going to create a button directory. So I can add a new directory called button. And in this folder, we're going to add a new file called index.tsx. And in this, we will just export a constant called button and create a quick button component that will have a button element with the role of button, the type of submit, and with the text submit in it. In our source app directory, we're going to create a new directory called blog. And in this blog, we will create another new directory called blog1. And in our blog1, we'll create a new file called page.tsx. And in our page.tsx, we're going to import our button from our @components button. To do this the long way, we would have to add 3 sets of dots to get it to the components directory and then finally to the button directory. But instead of all of that, we can just use @ and we see that it recognizes the directory without us having to do it the long way. We can now export our default function. We'll call it page, and we're going to simply return our button. So now if I run p&pm dev and then go to blog1, we just see our submit button show up there. Of course, if we set it up the old-fashioned way, nothing changes. This still works, but we'll get this notice that the import can be shortened, and we can replace it with the much shorter version there. And that's it for how to get set up with Next.js. You can install Next.js automatically or take the manual route and configure it exactly like you want. Either way, you have the ability to structure your project however you'd like, and you can choose the options that best fit your needs. If you found this video helpful, please like it and share it with others who might also find it useful. Check to make sure you're subscribed to my channel and receiving notifications so you never miss when I release more content about Next.js, Payload CMS, Tailwind CSS, and more. If you have questions or suggestions, please leave those in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Until then, I'll see you on the next one.